I don't think I was sharing the right screen. Yeah, I think it's the one I want to share. Okay.
Okay, that's working.
Go ahead and get started.
Good.
Can you see the screen okay?
Yes, we can see the screen. Very good.
Okay, I think I will stop the camera. I've been having some challenges with internet today, so I think I'll stop sharing. I probably am sharing now. Hello, everyone. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Back up at the top of my screen. So in a continuation of Jacob's solutions for contaminated site management, I'd like today to talk about decommissioning, decontamination, dismantlement, and disposal activities as part of urban regeneration schemes. So by way of a presentation summary, I'll start with a short summary of D4 services. So what is D4? And then talk through kind of what our end-to-end delivery strategy looks like in Jacobs, and then run through a few recent examples. So there was a project in Thailand that kind of started everything off, and then we kind of stepped it up in India, took a little bit, I guess, higher level of complexity, and now we're implementing a job in the UK, which is a very complicated, full D4 project, including remediation straight through to support for eventual residential development. And then I'll present and talk about some learnings from all of our experiences to date, and then I'll take some questions at the end. So feel free to ask questions as we go, and let me know if you're able to see the screen, if everything looks okay. Like I said, I'm fairly new to this.
Hi, Jim, this is Claudio. I can see you well. I would only suggest that you put in presentation mode so we don't see all the other features on the side of your screen.
And I'm afraid I may have lost connection.
We hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I was saying at the beginning that I've been having some internet problems and I need to sort that out, but it just seems to cut out. So you'll just have to work with me on that. What, you were saying something, Claudio? Is there anything?
Just suggesting that you put in a presentation mode so we don't see your side features on the back of your presentation.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. Okay, so again, just by way of summary, I'll go through what is D4, run through some end-to-end delivery strategies, and then look at some recent example projects, run through some learnings, and then take some questions at the end. So what is D4? Decommissioning, decontamination, dismantlement, and disposal. This is Jacobs' integrated approach to D4 and remediation services. So really, the process begins with providing technical advice to our owners, whether current owners or potential buyers looking to demolish any contaminated infrastructure. And then, moving into a risk assessment prior to demolition commencement is an important part. We then will engage in sampling both of materials and building fabric for estimating actual quantities for disposal, for management longer term with the project implementation. And then we also do focused industrial hygiene and monitoring so that we're aware of what perhaps our people are and our subcontractors are being potentially exposed to. And in many cases, we do utilize existing staff with the existing client because they know the process best. They really know the process and can help to identify pitfalls, identify synergies and efficiencies that we can take advantage of going forward. Oftentimes we integrate these processes into the D4 processes, both into soil and groundwater remediation also. And then ultimately we're providing practical advice on how to undertake this demolition, utilizing industrial technologies and solving complex demolition problems, and then advising on the control and management of the overall demolition process. So here to the right, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but here to the right is a kind of a typical demolition schedule. Some of the things I'll point out are important milestones of the process. Conducting a preliminary demolition hazard assessment is a key part of everything we do. Really looking to identify hazards, risks as we go. It's an opportunity really to sit down with the operators, with management, to work through and identify some of the challenges that we face or will face as we implement the D4. It helps us to determine and identify waste streams and potential treatment methods that we can undertake. And then as we go along, different timing of the schedule, removing hazardous materials, but then, getting to a point where once we've kind of compiled all the information and we've got to a certain point, we perform a HAZDEM again, a final HAZDEM, a demolition hazard study, and then, drive towards completion when we actually get into the full decommissioning, decontamination, dismantlement, and disposal. So in this case, where do we apply this capability? What we often find is that we're asked to provide guidance to clients where there's little regulation involved or available. We're often operating in different countries where there's little regulation available, and then we're advising on how to accomplish these D4 works while maintaining health and safety, risk analysis and liability reduction standards that might be separate from the country standards, the national standards, but are standards that are required by our clients. And this is often part of divesting industrial facilities, and it oftentimes requires removal of legacy contamination. So this is sometimes very complex industrial processes that we have to focus on, remove decontaminate everything, and then get it into a position to where we can take it down safely. And it requires a sequence of processes that really require a methodical approach. Those HAZDEM, preliminary HAZDEM and final HAZDEM processes are very important. And we take these facilities down to above and oftentimes do above and below ground demolition, and then get in soil and groundwater remediation depending on the complexity of the project. And it's the SIMOPS, the simultaneous operations of these processes that make this very challenging. We're oftentimes doing these at the same time, having to manage risk from both the remediation perspective, but also the demolition perspective also. So what we're striving to doesn't always happen with each project we're working on, but is an end-to-end delivery strategy. And this is where we want to, adapt to the needs of each individual project and each individual client. So we're identifying really and defining a delivery strategy that might involve, even from site selection, helping to assist the client to identify sites, working through due diligence, if that's the case, but then going through the D4 process and environmental remediation while connecting the traditional planning aspects of it to get the planning application perhaps in support of a land use change, if it's from industrial to commercial or from industrial to residential. Then we bring in, Jacobs Engineering and Construction Services that, with specialist disciplines, focusing on and considering sustainable development goals. In this case, in many cases, we're talking clean water and sanitation, maybe in support of development of sustainable cities and communities, and then, responsible consumption and production, and life on land. So these are the SDGs defined by the United Nations that you may be familiar with. And then, focusing on specific matters from, front-end advising through to health and safety and risk management becomes a very important element of what we're doing, where we focus on identifying, a risk-reward type arrangement where we're managing risk, but we're helping our client also manage their risk. So really, we're focusing on project delivery, in operational and business efficiencies, and focusing on a total project end-to-end service. So the first example I'll run through is probably the simplest of projects that we've worked on. One in Thailand, where this was more a site closure scenario, a sale of the property, and we were focusing on running a D4 workshop. We wanted to, in this case, we were utilizing our existing client staff for decommissioning of the facility, for decontamination of the facility. And then really in this workshop, we're identifying the differences between normal operations and shutdown. That's a pretty key element because, these people know their process. They know how to operate it in a manufacturing setting, but in this case, we're going to decommissioning, decontamination, and eventual demolition of that process. So want to bring them along the way, and to also then involve management and get management buy-in. That's an important element to the process. And in this case, we wanted to establish clear and aligned organizational structure. We created waste flow charts. You can see here to the right, everything from identifying where we're draining liquids and where we're decommissioning processes to performing wipe samples to determine cleanliness. All important elements to get to an endpoint involving different stakeholders, whether it be the client, whether it be Jacobs, whether it be the waste contractor. And then also an important element always is the scrap steel contractor, because we know that we can get return value, salvage value on that steel and other elements. So just really mapping that all out so it's clear to everybody involved what we're undertaking, and then health and safety, providing health and safety guidance overall. That becomes an important element with the HASDEM regarding contaminant handling requirements and sequencing guidance and program management. We really want to focus on reuse of existing infrastructure. In this particular case, we were able to take existing equipment, decontaminate it, and sell it for salvage value. Another element of this particular project was a UST replacement and removal. In this particular case was a replacement, not just a removal. And then we removed contaminated soil along the way too. So the next example I'd like to touch on, and again, feel free to ask questions. Don't want to make this a one-way conversation, but in this case, we kind of stepped it up in level of complexity. This was a D4 and more of a site regeneration scenario. It's an ongoing project that we're doing now, where the sale will involve complete demolition of the building. We'll be performing some of the demolition activities and then also doing soil remediation that eventually that new buyer will take on the property and redevelopment into more of a commercial. So going from an industrial to a commercial land use. So in this particular case, there are two separate work streams on the demolition side. On the D4 side, we're decontaminating contaminant residue in a production basement. So in this particular case, this was where operations mainly, waste collection, operations were performed. In this case, we're required to set up an air recirculation system to mitigate baseline contaminant exposures. And then we're cleaning up and decontaminating that contaminant in a basement area. It's a very confined, not entirely a confined space, but a very limited access space. So we were required to verify contaminant concentrations through measurements, and then characterizing debris for handover to the client. And then we're doing focused removal of contaminated concrete, both in a floor and a slab, and then basement sidewalls that have been impacted by a volatile contaminant, prior to demolition of the facility. And then another process, and an actual manufacturing process element of the facility is a demolition of a pickling plant area. In this particular case, we mobilized, set up demolition work zones and waste segregation zones, and then focused on demolition of the pickling plant and associated structures. So this was a pickling plant that we took down to slab level. The subsequent remediation will involve taking up the slab and excavating contaminated soil beneath the building. In this particular case, it was a spent acid treatment plant downstream of the pickling plant before it went to the effluent neutralization system. So a fairly complex, fairly chemical handling intensive process that took a lot of cleaning, decontamination prior to actually taking the building down. We did sampling of the surfaces of the building to characterize the waste debris that went off. And in most cases, we were able to actually collect for reuse concrete. In some cases, some of the waste had to go off-site as hazardous, but we performed that waste classification, non-haz and haz, and then we segregated the waste, which went off to a non-haz, more of a, we call it C and D here, more of a construction debris landfill, and then classified also hazardous other material, and then identified other equipment that could be salvaged, along with waste disposal and recycling. So here's some of the just a few pictures from this particular operation. This was done during COVID, so I guess it added wrinkle to the overall operations. We had to cease operations in the middle of the work, and as India entered lockdown, and then we waited until lockdown was lifted, and then quarantined the team before they went back on site. So we created a bit of a bubble where the team was isolated, really, in a separate housing, where their accommodations were. They went in to do the work on a daily basis, and then they returned to their accommodations. But setting up that bubble was successful. We had no issues with COVID or exposures or infections during the latter part of the implementation. Here in this picture here, we, the social distancing, we have markings for individuals during a toolbox talk to be clear in their separation to avoid infections. And then you can just see some of the pictures here, starting with the demolition through to partial demolition through to the end, where we stage debris here, and here it's waiting to be loaded and taken off-site for off-site disposal. Okay, the next example I'll talk about is in the UK. This is a site that's a full site closure, D4 services through to residential development. So in phase one of the works, we were engaged in planning and D4 design work. So supporting the planning application in this particular case. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail, but then planning the actual design works. And then phase two is the implementation, which we're undertaking as we speak, involving decontamination, demolition. Interesting element here was a gull management program where gulls are a protected species on the site, through to earthworks, and then we have an ongoing planning support effort with this project. So phase one, the planning and design, we engaged initially in a core scope of perform transport assessments. So in this particular case, it's being redeveloped into a residential complex, and had to undergo transport assessments to look at transportation in the area. Done flood risk assessments, phase one habitat surveys, both for bats and gulls in this particular case on an ecological basis. We looked at drainage and then utility and topographic surveys. So with the utility surveys, we went in with geophysical techniques to identify underground utilities that will eventually be removed as part of the overall demolition and redevelopment. And then for D4, the planning aspects of the D4 process really focused on risk management. Performing that HASDEM up front in the process is a key part to manage overall both the human health risk, but also the physical risks of implementing and the overall works. And these are culminated, reported in a 4D report that's reported to the client. We perform baseline surveys, both of mercury and lead chip. In this particular case, there's a radiological survey that was looked at, and then a waste optioneering that really identified the different waste streams and pathways for disposal pathways for all the waste. So in this case, we had multiple types of hazardous materials and substances that we were managing and dealing with the facility. Asbestos abatement was an important one. There was asbestos throughout the facility, both with lining of piping, but also there was asbestos plates for the roof structure that had to be removed. So we performed a full refurbishment and demolition asbestos survey prior to commencing the abatement. And then we brought in licensed asbestos containing material subcontractors that will be charged with removing this material from the site. Next phase was a contaminant cleaning. So in this case, we're focusing on areas of concern that we had to screen and identify the specialist subcontractors to actually perform the cleaning, decontamination, removal, and disposal of, in this particular case, residual mercury. Lead paint, as it turned out, wasn't an issue for us. We had done chip sampling and identified that lead paint was not an issue for us. So that in the case of concrete materials, we didn't have to come in and actually decontaminate the concrete, remove the paint, that it could be just crushed as is and used as either fill material on the site or taken off site as needed. And then the demolition works, the next phase of the works will be conducting these in compliance with building operations and local regulations. We'll start with a soft strip removal of the internals, and all units and ancillary structures will be stripped internally and externally of all non-structural elements before we take down the superstructure. And then the superstructure is brought down by machine, and then all uncontaminated demolition materials such as block and brickwork, we're going to use that to backfill into the site. We'll segregate that for reuse on site where we can. And then all other materials that are contaminated will go off site to off-site landfill. And then any other materials can be sold or recovered by a third party, then that's salvage value to go into the overall project financials. And then the final stage involving earthworks. In this particular case, we're taking the structures down to grade, down to slab, and then, but because we are going to create a base level of the site, we're taking out also all the foundations, all the utilities, and leveling the site to create a cut fill neutral project. So we don't want to be having to bring material onto site. So it's a cut fill neutral. We're bringing only on material on site that we need, but we're trying to make up as much from the concrete slabs and column bases and foundations that we can to be broken up and used for reuse at the site. And then we'll perform the additional remediation services after the removal of the foundations. We do know there is some subslab contamination, and we're using an open space criteria that takes us into ultimately a residential criteria, where we're identifying hotspots, removing those hotspots, and then identifying potentially treatment options. We may need to go to an on-site solidification stabilization process ultimately to manage the contaminated materials. And then we'll temporarily store those materials before being, where we can take it off-site cost effectively. And those will be taken off-site to an appropriately licensed off-site facility, or in this case, hopefully more reused on-site. The objective really is to recycle, reuse, and reduce any materials, to segregate materials, and reduce the amount that actually goes off-site. So some of the learnings that we've, accumulated along the way, it's really important to, identify a robust D4 process to ensure that we're overseeing the works straight through from, the initial characterization, documenting everything that from the baseline characterization through to the decontamination, and bringing really the full depth and breadth of services to take the project end to end. And what's key, I think, not only from a management process, but a client management process is to really early involvement of management, but also all stakeholders in the process, so that everyone is involved and has buy-in in the process. It's well documented, and then it's clear at the end what's been accomplished and how it's been accomplished. And then we want to remain flexible, so that the plan aligns with site conditions. This is a scope of work that really, the amount of change that occurs, the management of change that's required in the process is immense. So, remaining flexible, staying on top of the management of change is a key learning that we've taken forward through all these different projects we've worked on. And then maintaining strict health and safety with the HASDEM process, and the D4 work plan, the development of the D4 work plan that not only documents the process of what we're going to do, but documents the health and safety requirements. It really becomes the Bible of the project. It becomes what we go to, what the client goes to as the roadmap of the overall delivery. And promoting these sustainable development goals where appropriate to accomplish our objectives, and ensuring that recommended cleaning practices are undertaken. We've had situations where subcontractors have gone in, haven't necessarily, in the case where we're not managing those contractors, they might undertake a decontamination or a cleaning practice that's not appropriate, and they end up spreading the contamination. We really want to be controlling those decontamination procedures up front to avoid that type of situation. And then again, that D4 guidance document becomes the Bible, both from the client perspective and our perspective, to document what we're doing, and retaining all the documentation going forward with waste disposal, equipment removal, which is evidence against any future queries or claims against the project. So I guess that's about it. I think I probably wrapped up in in the 20 minutes or so. That gives us about 10 minutes for questions. Does anyone have any questions?
Hi, Jim. This is Claudio. Maybe I can break the ice.
Sure.
Thank you for a good presentation. One question, given the experience that we are gaining in different geographies, you spoke about Thailand, India, and then UK or Scotland, where would you see are the biggest differences and challenges in implementing a rigorous 4D program across different geographies? Is there regulation that is really pushing hard? Is there kind of a market? Is availability of contractors?
Yeah, you cut out there a little bit in the end. That's my internet connection. But yeah, I think it's, if you compare those three geographies, clearly the UK has the most rigorous, regulations with their CDM regulations. So the more that there's a defined, base of regulations, then it becomes both more rigorous, but also more of a challenge to adhere to the local regulations, the national regulations. Where in Thailand and India, there are some regulations, but they're certainly not as stringent as in the UK or Europe or the US. So that I think that really becomes the determining factor of success is the extent of regulations and our ability to adhere with the local team to those regulations.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. Guess that may be it then. Thank you for having me talk. Hope everything's going well with RemTech and the first day of our virtual reality here with COVID. Everything going okay, Claudio?
Yes, so far the good impression. I mean, I hope the quality of the presentation is going to be as at least as good as yours, and from a content and connection standpoint. And yeah, we look forward for the continuation, and let's continue expanding the world and having more attendants joining. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. You cut out there again with my internet connection, but I think I got the gist of it. So I will stop sharing now, and I guess that's it. So again, thank you and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim.